Tilde. In Finland in 1941, there was a dog named Jackie. This dog was owned by a gentleman named Tor Borg and his wife, and they had nicknamed their dog Hitler. And this came about because at some point Jackie was trained to raise a single paw whenever the name Hitler was mentioned. And this was quite amusing to Mr. Borg's wife, given that she was virulently anti-Nazi. Now, word of this dog and this behaviour spread around a little bit, and what with Finland being an ally and co-belligerent of the Nazi Reich at the time, word of this dog and its behaviour eventually reached the German embassy in Finland, and from there all the way to the Nazi Party Chancellery in Germany, where in an exchange dated January 29th, 1941, German Vice-Consul Willy Erkenlentz in Helsinki wrote that, quote, "A witness, who does not want to be named, said he saw and heard how Borg's dog reacted to the command Hitler by raising its paw." End quote. And as a result of this, Mr. Borg was summoned to the German embassy in Helsinki, where he did admit that on a few occasions his wife called the dog Hitler, and that on a few occasions it did respond with a raised paw. But he was quoted as saying to Nazi officials that, quote, "the rumour might emanate from an episode in the summer of 1933, which happened within my family only, and which had no ulterior political background whatsoever," end quote. He also denied that his family or Jackie had done anything, quote, "that could be seen as an insult against the German Reich," end quote. It was noted at the time by Nazi officials that they simply did not believe his story. What followed was a 2-month campaign of what could reasonably be called intimidation. Mr. Borg's pharmaceutical firm had its suppliers targeted by the Nazi Reich and were pressured into ceasing their trade with him. However, 2 months later, in March 1941, the Chancellery decided that, quote, "considering that the circumstances could not be solved completely, it is not necessary to press charges," end quote. This was the German Chancellery basically admitting that, with a lack of evidence and a lack of solid witnesses, no charges could be brought against Mr. Borg, his wife, or his dog. Given that the entire scenario actually made it to the office of the Chancellery, it is possible, however still currently unknown, whether or not the Führer himself, Adolf Hitler, had become involved in the saga. And being an animal lover and a fellow dog owner himself, there is a slim chance that that could have happened. But we will probably never know for sure. In April 2016, a man by the name of Mark Meekin, posting under the pseudonym Count Dankula, posted to YouTube a video titled "Mate, Your Dog's a Nazi," in which he states, quote, "My girlfriend is always ranting and raving about how cute and adorable her wee dog is, and so I thought that I would turn him into the least cute thing that I could think of, which is a Nazi," end quote. In this video, he shows his dog responding to the phrase "Sieg Heil" by raising one of its paws, and turning to face him whenever he utters the phrase "Gas the Jews," and exhibiting the same behaviour when he says the word Jews. Mr. Meekin was arrested for committing a hate crime, and in March 2018 convicted of being grossly offensive, and that was done under the Communications Act because his video was apparently anti-Semitic and racist in nature, and is claimed to have been aggravated by religious prejudice. Mr. Meechan's sentencing will be happening later in April 2018. So, with all of that out of the way, I'm sure you can see why I have titled this video as I have. It would seem that the UK has succeeded where the Nazi Reich failed, and has successfully prosecuted someone for making fun of Nazis. With all of this out of the way, we now find ourselves in a very curious position. Now, I could sit here and talk about how, as someone who supports free speech, I find this to be completely ridiculous. I could point out that this is not anti-Semitic, because it is not actually calling for violence against Jewish people. It is in fact mocking people who were anti-Semitic. I could sit and point out that freedom of speech necessarily protects people who want to be offensive or to be a little bit edgy, but let's be honest, there's enough of that out there already. It's easy to sit back and just say, well, I didn't find it funny, but I still totally support this guy's right to say it. It's easy to sit and list off other times that other comedians have made fun of Nazis and not been arrested for it, but instead of doing all of that, I think it might be a little more fun to look a little further afield. Clicking around the internet in regards to this topic, reading articles by people and watching videos by others here on YouTube, I've noticed that this issue seems to be crossing pretty much every partisan and ideological line out there, with the exception of the far-left progressive progressives who seem to be the only people in favour of what's happened. And the reason that this interests me is because it would seem to indicate that this event could very well be a crux for something larger, something ideally very tangible. Threats to free speech and freedom of expression aren't anything new, of course. Need I remind anyone that here in the UK we're seeing anywhere from 5 to 10 people every single day being arrested by British police for any sort of hate speech. Keep in mind that is just the arrest rate, not the conviction rate. Although that observation shouldn't make it any less startling. It's just that this case happens to have landed firmly in the backyard of the average internet shitposter. You no longer have to actually be making politically or ideologically motivated speeches, or otherwise engaging with something actually political, in order to be arrested in the UK and then convicted of something. All you need to do is to be telling a joke. And from that joke, the powers that be will decide what your true motivation was. They will reach inside your mind and place within any motivation that they believe could have made you do something. And it will not be favourable nor charitable, especially given that the police define a hate crime as any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based on a person's race or perceived race, religion or perceived religion, sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation, disability or perceived disability, or any crime motivated by hostility or prejudice against a person who is transgender or perceived as transgender. They also note that not all hate incidents will amount to criminal offences, but it is equally important that these are reported and recorded by the police, and that you don't actually need evidence of the hate element, because that can be determined simply by a witness or a police officer for you. So I mentioned whether or not this may eventually lead to something a little more tangible, something a little more real world. And the reason for that wonder is quite simple. Obviously, since this case has gone through the court system, this is now going to work as a precedent. It is a case upon which other cases in the future could potentially be built. And combining this fact with the law stating that victims or even third parties can define basically whether or not a crime has taken place in regards to hate speech, places us firmly on the road towards a quite dystopian future. And at the risk of sounding cliched and quoting the entire "they came for X but I said nothing because I wasn't X" spiel, this is a case which has the potential to bring the widespread problem that the UK is currently facing to a wider audience, especially given the harmless nature of the humour in question. Much as some people would like to make cringe-inducing humour or bad taste a crime, it is simply not a workable position because it will lead to an inevitable slippery slope. And let's not forget that just because in some circumstances a slippery slope can be a fallacious way of thinking, it is not always the case. And in some cases the term can simply be used to attempt to dismiss the logical observation that Y follows X. As for whether or not this event in isolation, or when combined with the earlier happenings where 3 news reporters were barred from entering the UK because they wanted to interview someone the state has deemed guilty of wrongthink, has the ability to red pill the normies, as I believe the phrase would go, we'll just have to wait and see. Given that over the coming years there is the potential for the UK to redraft some of these hate speech laws, assuming the UK is actually ever able to leave the European Union, there is the potential for cases such as this one to be looked back upon as simply being a black mark in history, or it may simply stand as a small taster of things to come. Only time will tell, and only people's willingness to engage with these topics in the political sphere will have any chance of changing things.